Hello, everybody, in Fine Arts 109. Back here again for the final time. This will be the last video lecture of the semester for us. And we will be taking a look at how the very recent past has set up the movie industry as it looks right now. Now, that being said, just a little bit of class related business here before we launch into anything further. You will probably be watching this after you've submitted your final essay proposal. Those were due Sunday, April 26th, which is the date that I am recording this on. So if you're watching this and you haven't turned that in, make sure you get it in as soon as possible so I can give you your grade and your feedback on that written work. Beyond that, you've got the final essay itself is due on Sunday, May 10th. So you've got 2 weeks to take that outline and thesis and research and stretch it out into the full length essay. And then you'll have a final exam that you'll take on Brightspace. I'll make that available next week, and you can take that anytime. In that span, I will create on Brightspace an additional forum topic for this week, looking, as I always like to do at the end of the semester, for people to formulate questions that they want to see on the final exam. I think that's a really good way of uh, creating moments where you can start the studying process just by thinking back on what we've learned, what we've talked about. You are able to formulate questions, think about content, think about how you learn in a way that can make the exam easier. And then you can, I think, as importantly, uh, get this knowledge etched into your mind all the more firmly. So, uh, yeah, I'll put that on the discussion boards, and I'd love to see any questions that you all come up with, so I can integrate them into the exam itself. Beyond that, May 10th is also going to be the last date on which I will be accepting work. That's the cutoff for the semester. After that moment has passed, I will be grading for a couple of days, and you should see final grades completed and submitted sometime around the middle of that week. Probably the 13th or 14th is when I expect to submit final grades to the administration. Um, so yeah, let me know if you have any questions. Pop into our Zoom session, or send me an email. And by the way, since we are near the end of the semester here, feel free to pop into those Zoom sessions and say hello, say goodbye, whatever you want to do. I'm on there, and I'm happy to have a conversation if you're interested. All right. All that being said, we do have a bit more to cover today, and this is a chapter, honestly, that's still being written, and in many ways, it covers even stuff that happens since the semester began. But why don't we pick up where we had kind of left off when it comes to American cinema, the blockbuster era, born back in the 1970s and 1980s, still going for full force through the 90s, and really takes off beginning in the 2000s and 2010s. If the 70s and 80s saw the creation of blockbusters, the 2000s and 2010s saw them become the bedrock, almost the entire rock of the Hollywood system. And that is because they have kind of taken the blueprint of the Batman movie from 1989 and made that the whole structure of the entire film industry. You take a well-known pre-existing property, think Batman, think the Avengers, think Spider-Man, think Harry Potter, think Star Trek, Star Wars, and you create a film around that property that has this enormous audience already interested, willing to show up, and you publicize the ever loving hell out of it, and turn it into a major media event. And then put it onto as many screens as possible. And the as many screens as possible thing is actually something that we should talk about really briefly here. Beginning in the 1980s and continuing through the 2000s, you see a new type of movie theater being constructed in the United States, a multiplex or a megaplex. Up until the 60s and 70s, most movie theaters were single screen. There was only one movie that could be shown there at a time. Um, but with the rise of suburban shopping malls in the 1960s and 70s, you get the attachment, sometimes directly to malls, sometimes just in the like shopping mall area out in the suburbs, of these multiplex and megaplex movie theater facilities where you can show 8 movies at once. You can show 12. You can show 30. I think that's the biggest one I've ever been to, a movie theater that had 30 screens. Some of them absolutely massive, cavernous amphitheaters that could hold hundreds of viewers. Some of them much smaller, maybe they hold 100 or so, but absolutely gigantic facilities. And employees must number in the hundreds, thousands of people go there in any given week, and this aids the release of bigger and bigger blockbusters. Something like, let me go look this up really quickly. Something like Avengers Endgame, when it came out last year, shattered records for box office, and a lot of that had to do with the fact that it was shown in so many theaters. 3,900 movie screens across the United States and Canada, plus 410 IMAX screens and 250 D-Box theaters. I don't even know what D-Box means. It sounds like an insult. You're a real D-Box, you know that? That's over 3,000 screens, nearly 30, I think over 3,500 screens devoted to just one movie. That is why it was able to come up with, God, how much was it? $350 million in 3 days when it came out on this weekend last year. For a movie to average $100 million per day in the weekend that it's released is unbelievable. That would have been unimaginable even 20 years ago. The very first movie to ever make $100 million the weekend it was released was the first Spider-Man movie in 2002. That was monumental. I remember reading that headline in high school and my jaw dropped and I went, holy shit, 100 million in one weekend? And then 20 years later, Avengers Endgame, not even 20 years later, 17 years later, people born that weekend watched Avengers Endgame in high school. You get what I'm saying. That is an enormous increase there, obviously. A lot of that is because movie studios, especially Disney, have become very good at marketing their products and building up these big hype machines. And a lot of it has to do with inflated ticket prices, inflated screen counts, but more and more blockbusters are what makes the industry operate. They are enormously expensive to produce and distribute an Avengers film. Disney probably spends in excess of $600 million at a minimum. I would guess probably closer to $1 billion. But if the movie then makes $1 billion worldwide in the weekend that it opens, you see a return on your investment, and that is what you're looking for. This is also aided by the fact that these blockbusters are more and more just one, maybe the focal point, but only one element in a broader media landscape that revolves around them. Think of something like Star Wars, Avengers, all these Disney properties. They are not the only way that Disney makes revenue off of these films. You see as well toys, video games, clothing, costumes, knickknacks, branding, movie soundtracks, TV tie-ins. All of that is a process called part of a process called horizontal integration. Movie studios these days are just one part of larger mass media conglomerates, which are able to synergize all of their different companies into one massive marketing push. So Disney's probably the most powerful example of this these days, just because they have grown so much and own so many major properties. It's worth noting Disney was not a major studio until the 1990s. I would say even as late as the 1980s, like Disney only really made family movies, like animated films, that sort of thing. They did not become the player they are until Michael Eisner took over in the 1980s and started maximizing revenue from those animated films, capitalized on that, and bought ABC, the TV network, in the 1990s. And especially under Bob Iger, who just stepped down as their CEO a couple of months ago, they have gone on an enormous run of success, an enormous amount of box office and overall revenue, but also snapping up Pixar and Marvel and Star Wars and the entire 20th Century Fox film studio last year. All of these are acquisitions, and that's a big part of this. This is an era of acquisitions, mergers, buyouts. So Disney is just gobbling up all of these properties. Other companies have similarly become massive, horizontally integrated Conglomerates, something like Warner Brothers provides a pretty good example. If you'll remember, Warner Brothers was one of those studios that got bought out in the 1960s and 70s by a completely unrelated business. They eventually became independent once again and have gone through a couple of mergers since then. They merged with Time Publishing back in I think that was in the 1980s. Time and Warner Communications merged into Time Warner. Eventually, they also merged with America Online. I don't know if anybody remembers the brief era of AOL Time Warner, but that existed. And more recently, Time Warner sold the Time part of it. Time Publishing is a different company once again. And Warner Communications, or I think it's Warner Media, was bought by AT&T, the gigantic cell phone and internet service provider. So if you watch Harry Potter, you are watching a commercial product of AT&T through its subsidiary Warner Brothers, part of the larger Warner Communications entertainment conglomerate owned by AT&T. That's the kind of thing we're talking about these days. Most studios are part of large media conglomerates like that. Walt Disney Pictures and its studios are part of the Disney conglomerate. Warner Brothers is part of AT&T. Universal is part of Comcast. Paramount is owned by is it CBS or Viacom? Essentially, Paramount has been owned by a company called Viacom for about 25, 30 years. And Viacom and its sister company, CBS, keep merging and then splitting and then re-merging. I want to say they remerged, and I think CBS is the name of the corporation, but I'd have to double check. But that's like the CBS TV network, along with Paramount Pictures, Comedy Central, theme parks, stuff like that. That being said, Paramount Pictures has done pretty badly the past decade or so here. I keep wondering if they're going to get bought out by somebody in the not too distant future. And then the last of our major studios we talked about is Columbia and Sony. That obviously is part of the larger Sony corporation based out of Japan. So the same company that brings you PlayStation is also the one that brings you Into the Spider-Verse. That is taking the previous generation's corporate buyouts and blockbusters and amplifying them. So that's been one of the signature parts of American cinema in the past 20, 25 years or so, I would say. Just as big and just as influential and probably more long lasting than any particular like merger in this moment has been the digital revolution itself. Digital technology, what we mean in this case, is computer based, internet dependent forms of production and distribution. And that affects the industry in a lot of very complex ways. On the film production side of things, most Hollywood movies these days are not shot on film anymore. Celluloid is a relative rarity. Most movies are shot on digital cameras, so the light entering the lens no longer hits that physical film strip pulling 24 frames per second past the lens. Now it's all just captured on digital light sensors, which turn it into, ones and zeros, the same way that the camera on my laptop is doing right now. And that is definitely cheaper. It creates a very different look if you compare digital film versus celluloid. There is a different tone, there's a different color, there's a different warmth, and yeah, all of them. But it is cheaper. It definitely does help with the post-production process there. You no longer have to take your physical film strip and literally cut it and glue it together during the editing process, which was how it was done up until very recently. There's also been a lot of other digital impacts on the movie industry. Perhaps most visibly, the aid of computer-generated imagery has taken special effects to a completely different level. If you go back and watch those 70s and 80s blockbusters like Star Wars, like Close Encounters of the Third Kind, or like Indiana Jones, they relied on old-fashioned practical effects. Practical meant that there was actually a physical thing there. What a rarity these days. There are certainly still some movies that try to rely on practical effects. Mad Max Fury Road comes to mind as an example of something that tried to minimize the usage of CGI, especially when it came to like stunt work in the action sequences. But even then, there's a heavy dose of CGI for things like color correction, for things like fixing up the background, for deleting elements that they don't want in the final product. So CGI has become indispensable, especially for big blockbusters, but it's used in basically every movie at this point. CGI, as well as other digital related digital processes like color correction, um, are something that allows you to take what you recorded on the film set or on location and tweak it into a better or idealized shape. Um, this is something that is still pretty visible to us when we see CGI. Some of it does look remarkably realistic, some of it maybe less so. And I definitely do think, at least personally speaking, there are certainly some movies where the the aesthetic effect is less than pleasing when you see over reliance on CGI. I'm thinking particularly of the Star Wars prequel trilogy from the early 2000s, where CGI wasn't as good looking as it is today, but George Lucas didn't care. He was going to use it everywhere. And those movies, in my opinion, are not just bad and boring, but ugly. And that's a shame because Star Wars is a very popular film genre. The Last Jedi, by the way, good movie. I don't care if you disagree. It's a very good movie. Get out of here, haters. Um, so there's the effect of CGI. There's the effect of digital filmmaking. There's also obviously been a huge impact when it comes to digital distribution. It was not until the 1980s that we had home movie watching on anything other than TV. And TV wasn't something you controlled. It was just like, oh, it's 8 p.m. on a Sunday. I wonder if they've got an old movie on NBC tonight. But in the age of Netflix, that is obviously very different. Um, the especially in the past decade here, the rise of streaming platforms like Netflix, like Hulu, like Amazon Prime has been enormous on the film industry. Like Netflix is not a film studio, but it would feel really weird not to talk about the film industry without talking about Netflix these days. Despite the fact that they do not really release their movies in a traditional way, if they do get a theatrical release, a Netflix film, it's usually just an awards qualifying one, something like The Irishman or Marriage Story, were released into theaters for a couple of weeks last fall and then debuted on Netflix almost immediately thereafter so they could rack up Oscar nominations, which are still based upon theatrical release. And we also don't know how much money Netflix makes. They don't. There's no independent verification of their numbers. They claim something like Bird Box was seen by like 100 million people when it came out a year and a half ago. If that had been a major theatrical release and 100 million people had gone to see it, it would have been the number one movie of the year. Do we think Bird Box made more money than The Avengers if it had been in theaters? No, I don't think so. But that also points to a very interesting change in how people view movies. New movies can just be in your living room at this point. It's no longer going out. It's no longer a special event. And that is something that Netflix has helped to normalize. Up until a decade ago, straight to home video meant crap. Whereas now, something like The Irishman is a Best Picture nominee, despite the fact that it was straight to streaming. It was made for streaming, in fact. And that is going to present, I think, a very interesting conundrum, especially for us to think about in the midst of the coronavirus lockdown. There are no movies scheduled for wide theatrical release between now, when I'm recording this in April, and July. And the odds of anything coming out in July are honestly pretty low. Like, best case scenario, movie theaters reopen by July. They haven't been open for a month and a half already. So we're going to talk about a third of the year where there's no theatrical releases, and yet movies are getting distributed. Trolls World Tour had the world's first digital world premiere a couple of weeks ago, where they just realized they couldn't distribute it in theaters because of the lockdown, and so they just uploaded it onto streaming platforms, and you could download it for 48 hours. I think it was $20 to buy a 48-hour rental of Trolls World Tour. I feel bad for the parents who had to do that. My kids are not old enough to give a shit yet. But that is something that I wonder how normal it's going to become. I wonder how long it's going to take us to feel comfortable going back to movie theaters. I will admit, as much as I love movies and as much as I love teaching about them, I haven't felt comfortable in movie theaters for a couple of years now, ever since the shooting at Dark Knight Rises screening in Aurora, Colorado. That just shook me up enough that I always feel a little tense when I go to the movies, and with young kids, I go to the movies even less. I haven't gone to a movie theater since Black Panther came out. Another one of those mega blockbusters, of course. But you know, I will be happy to sit down this week and watch Parasite on Hulu, so I can finally catch up there. That is something that Hollywood is not resisting in the way that they resisted maybe the launch of television or the launch of VHS back in the 50s and 80s. Hollywood seems to be embracing this. You can see that in all the competitors that are being created for Netflix right now. Disney Plus, HBO Max, Peacock are joining the field here to try and grab some of that massive audience, 50 million subscribers in the United States from Netflix. There's a lot of money to be made by entertaining people on their couches. And for me, that's going to raise an interesting question about the future of cinema. We're looking at it right now. When will we reach the point where movie theaters stop being necessary? Are we already there? Are we ever going to go back to a world where a movie like Avengers gets released on 3,000 screens? Will that ever happen again? Or will we just see many movie theaters close, perhaps because of the lockdown or because of the changes in business? Most movies getting released on streaming platforms, and only the biggest blockbusters like your Avengers, your Star Warses, those sorts of things, getting a theatrical window that's maybe a month and a half long, and then debuting on Disney Plus immediately thereafter. I I thought that was a more distant future thing. Maybe by the 2030s, that would be the business model. I think the coronavirus lockdown might speed that up a little bit. I would not be too terribly surprised if if you saw something like Black Panther 2 debut directly onto Disney Plus in a couple of years here, because that will get a huge number of subscriptions, and it will show that Disney doesn't need to rely on companies and venues that they don't control. If that makes as much money for Disney Plus as I think they hope it might, that would be maybe the biggest moment in cinematic history since the creation of the studio system 100 years ago. Anyway, that's a little bit of speculation, but I do definitely think the history trend lines are pointing that way. All that being said, as the end of the time I want to take from you this week, I hope you've all enjoyed this course over the past 16 weeks here. I'm sorry we didn't get to share the classroom, share the experience of watching these movies as often as we should have been able to, but it has been my pleasure, and I hope you all still learned a lot, enjoyed what you saw and what you learned here, and good luck with everything you do in the rest of the future, and especially while all of this persists. Stay healthy and stay at home. Bye, everyone.